This is Clean and Prosperous California. And today we'll be talking about the past, present, and future of California's cap and trade program with myself, the executive director of Clean and Prosperous California, and then our three board members, Joe Nation, Emily Wimberger, and Alicia Robinson. We gave very detailed bios for everybody in the readout, so I will skip those, but I will emphasize that all of the board members are speaking on their own behalf as a board member of Clean and Prosperous California and not in any of their other capacities. So before we dive in, some housekeeping. The webinar is open to the public, including press. There will be a presentation by each of us, followed by Q&A. Feel free to ask questions at any time, including during our presentations. It is moderated, so use the Q&A function on Zoom. And then we send a recording out a couple or a few days after the webinar. Our next webinar actually won't be 1 week from today. We'll be in Sacramento on that Wednesday doing meetings. But the next webinar will be 2 weeks from today, June 11th at 1 p.m. The topic will be lesson learned from Washington's Cap and Invest program, and that will feature Clean and Prosperous Washington. And I'm actually in Brussels right now with Clean and Prosperous Washington, meeting with EU ETS officials and others. And that's a photo of the group I'm hanging out with this week. So I'm really looking forward to sharing lessons learned from Washington and introducing some Clean and Prosperous Washington staff and Washington state legislators to a California audience. Lastly, I guess this is housekeeping as well. If you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, you can find the newsletter link at cleanprosperousca.org. All right, that's a picture of all of us. Before I turn to Joe, so we're going to go in chronological order here. And Alicia, if you go to the next slide, we're going to kind of frame the cap and trade program kind of consistent with the past, present, and future title of the webinar. We're going to frame the cap and trade program over 3 eras. So the first era is really what I call the backstop era. This is kind of the program from 2013 to 2018, when AB 32 was really the operative statute, and the scoping plan had the cap and trade program in a backstop role. And what the backstop rule means is really the program was expected to achieve like 10% of the state's reductions, and its role was, if another policy failed, that the cap and trade program would pick up the slack. And during this period, the price really rode the minimum price. It rode the price floor. So Joe will kind of focus on this era, which is the past, I think, of the cap and trade program. Emily will then talk about this era where the cap and trade program took on a larger role in the portfolio. So specifically, the scoping plan wanted to achieve 1/3 of the state's total greenhouse gas reductions through 2030 during this period. This period, I would argue, kind of extended from 2018 to 2024. The relevant statute was AB 398, and during this time, we saw prices come significantly off the floor. And then finally, the era we're in today, I'm calling the uncertainty area. The 2022 scoping plan didn't explicitly quantify what role the cap and trade program is going to play beyond 2030. The relevant statute is something that's being discussed right now. And we've seen the allowance price kind of go from record highs back down to the price floor, given regulatory and legislative uncertainty. So Alicia and I will talk about that era. And hopefully by that time, we'll have a very comprehensive download of cap and trade to date, and we'll have a good Q&A session afterwards. So with that, I will hand over to Joe to kind of cover the backstop era.
Great. Thanks, Clayton. Since I'm by far the oldest person on the board and maybe one of the oldest people in this meeting, I'll talk about the past. And I wanted to provide some historical context for where we are today and talk about the days leading up to AB 32, sort of how it happened, and we'll probably talk about some similarities between that world and the world that we're in right now. I always like to remind people and students in my classes that there wasn't a lot of support for action on climate in the late 90s and the early 2000s. In fact, I always bring up this Senate Resolution 98, which actually passed by 95 to 0 in 1997. And it basically said the US is not going to sign anything that doesn't require everyone to make the same sort of reduction sacrifices that the US economy will make. And we're not going to do anything that's going to harm the economy. And I always point to that vote of 95 to 0 because even the most liberal members of the US Senate voted for that resolution. W. Bush came along and said in March of 2001 that he would not implement Kyoto. And instead, there was this focus on intensity targets. Cap and trade was certainly not on the agenda in Washington, D.C. And this intensity target was pretty meaningless when you assume that economic growth was going to be X%, probably greater than 18% up during that time period. So again, not the same situation we have today, but still not the best of circumstances. Next slide, please. And I also want to go back and just sort of highlight where the public was back in the early 2000s. So the good news is if you look at that blue line at the bottom, the people are more and more concerned about global warming is the question, climate change, and have been since the late 1970s. And so we're now up to about 50%. So we're getting close. And essentially, I always like looking at some of these, very red states where you actually have numbers where the numbers are pretty good for people who are working on climate action. But back in the in the late 90s and the early 2000s, if you can go to the next slide, please, we'll highlight where the public was. So only about 1/3 of people actually viewed this as a threat. So again, 1/3 back then, about 50% today. The good news is the public's with us. We just got to get politicians, I think, to catch up, which is what we did back. I guess I would just say that we were probably pretty aggressive in what we thought we could do with AB 32 and similar legislation. Next slide. Inconvenient truth. Today, you sort of forget how, when that was released, and this actually wasn't released until May of 2006. So again, climate really wasn't on the map back then. The good news is it is today. And again, those public numbers that I showed a minute ago show that we've made some progress. The next one, please. And then I wanted to also highlight sort of the precursor, if you will, to AB 32, the Pavley Standards, AB 1493, which if you were to ask Fran Pavley, I know she said this to me a number of times. And by the way, Fran really deserves the credit. She deserves 90+% of the credit for AB 32. I mean, she's the one who made it happen. But 1493 was a much tougher fight. And I wanted to highlight a couple things on 1493 was the Pavley Standards tailpipe emissions, but it required CARB to implement the quote maximum feasible and cost-effective reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's important because I want to focus on the fact that what the effort back then, whether it was 1493 or 32, was really on technology and on the economics. And that's one of the reasons I think, in the end, got a successful bill and a successful law. Next, please. So AB 32, again, when I teach this in my class or one of my classes, I always ask people, how complicated do you think this bill was and how long was it? Well, it was only about 10 pages long. Depends how you format it, of course, but yeah, if you go to the Ledge Info site, it's about 10 pages. And 2/3 of it contained general provisions, definitions, preamble, and so forth. only one third, so only about 3 pages of this bill were devoted to the market mechanisms and enforcement. And that was by design. It was done in such a way because we thought the most important thing was to set the target and then to let experts and other people design the system and to do something that would be technologically feasible and also economically efficient. Next slide, please. And then last thing I'm going to say is that, cap and trade is really based on three things in my mind: economic efficiency, technical expertise, and broad support. And I want to focus on the economic efficiency, and I want to remind people who aren't as old as me about how challenging the late 90s and early 2000s were in terms of the public's and also the political perspective or perspectives on energy. California had been through this horrible time in late 2000, early 2001, where we had blackouts across the state. Wholesale electricity prices were up 11 times that December compared to the previous December. All sorts of quote unquote price gouging and that we saw. And so when I would go, and I will tell you the role that I think I played a little bit of a part on in AB 32 was convincing people that markets were actually good. Because back then people thought markets were not very good, in part because of what happened with the energy crisis in late December of 2000, early 2001. So luckily, everyone got on board. All Democrats, one Republican voted for the bill in the end. We recognize that we did not have the expertise. Again, I think this is where there's some parallels with this year. We don't have the expertise. The legislature didn't at the time to deal with those technical issues. And so we thought, let's pick an agency that knows what they're doing, that has a track record. And I think CARB is well equipped for that. And the last thing I'll say is that, and again, parallels with today, I think we need to build a big tent and not make this about climate or energy, but it has to be to a great extent about health and about justice and about the economy. And if we're successful in doing that, then hopefully we'll be successful as we were back with AB 32. And I think that's my last slide.
Thank you, Joe. Emily, over to you for the next era.
I know I feel the need to insert a Taylor Swift joke here, but I think it is a little bit, I think I've seen this film before. I'm going to go back a little bit before 2018. I think this really starts in September of 2016 with the passage of SB 32, which set a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. Subsequently, the Air Resources Board put together California's 2017 climate change scoping plan. And this really outlined the pathway to get to that 2030 target. And really, this, as this graph shows, basically this was sort of a significant portion of the reductions were anticipated to come from the cap and trade program. And as Clayton mentioned, there was a departure in 2022, but in 2017, the scoping plan really outlined the anticipated reductions that would be achieved in 2030 from each measure. You can go to the next slide. So Joe also talked about cost effectiveness, and this is a chart from the 2017 scoping plan that outlines the anticipated cost of various measures within the portfolio. We always say California, you've got 11 pairs of suspenders and 4 belts. There's a lot of different policies that are being implemented with various objectives, but that all touch greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see here, the price does range quite substantially. And ones in bold are actually programs, measures that are in the scoping plan. The other ones were sort of measures that were outlined as potential, but did not make it into the final scoping plan process. This also shows, this is the impact to the California economy, and this was a nice trip down memory lane for me. I was the chief economist at the time at the Air Resources Board and actually put together this chart. And this really does outline sort of the scoping plan scenario was the chosen path. Alternative one was an alternative that did not have a cap and trade program. So that helps you sort of understand sort of the relative anticipated or modeled impact in 2030 of not including the cap and trade program, but having just prescriptive regulations. Alternative two was a carbon tax alternative. Alternative three was one that relied more heavily on cap and trade and less on a low carbon fuel standard. And alternative four was basically facility level caps, including a carbon tax. So this just goes to show that, yes, relying on the experts to do the modeling really does show that cap and trade was a cost-effective pathway for California. And next slide, please. It was also anticipated, as Clayton mentioned earlier, to take up a much larger portion of emission reductions, about 30% of all the anticipated reductions in 2030. That was something that was a departure from sort of the early days, and it was anticipated because of this cost effectiveness to really pick up a larger portion of emission reductions leading to the 2030 target. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about AB 398 and sort of how this came to be. So the scoping plan draft was released in January of 2017, right in the heyday of Trump administration 1.0, and it was a very different sort of vibe in California at the time. I remember I flew to Marrakesh for the COP right after the election, and everyone was so excited for the California delegation to be there, and to like tell people that we were still in. And it was there was a lot of rallying cries around states' rights and states' ability to really lead on climate, as California has often done. Most because, unfortunately by example, because of the air quality issues in California, but also because we just have a whole host of, really ambitious members of the legislature. We have really dedicated administration and public servants, and, there is an investment here. So AB 398 was, so the scoping plan outline, the draft scoping plan came out and outlined sort of the anticipated role of cap and trade. And then quickly thereafter, there were discussions about sort of cementing the role of cap and trade in California's post-2020 climate portfolio, and really thinking about what is needed to ensure that cap and trade will help get the reductions needed to get to 2030. So the legislature did approve AB 398 in July of 2017, and that really focused on a few key areas. There was added language around cost containment. So again, thinking about how do we make sure that the program is cost effective, but also that those costs are not unduly, that disproportionately we're not seeing huge consumer impacts, and how do we think about balancing that? Both sort of the regulatory side, but then also thinking about how the auction proceeds are used. So there was a lot of effort really to think about how these auction proceeds and auction revenues can go back to communities and really to enhance, additional greenhouse gas emission reductions. So AB 398 came out, and it was sort of, this is a cap and trade program, there's auctions. And we did see, with the reauthorization, there was a bump in the auction prices. And, there was some sort of, it was a long legislative process to get to the end and the signing of AB 398. And what we did see was that there was sort of a lull in auction revenue during that time. So I think it does point to the fact that, the market does like certainty. And that there is sort of many, many angles and many players in the game in terms of getting it across the finish line. So we are here in AB 398 land, and I think then I will kick it over to Clayton to talk about the next era.
Yeah, sure. So we're calling this one the uncertainty era. So next slide. And I would characterize the uncertainty as I was trying to characterize it maybe as whiplash, but maybe it feels like an acceleration followed by a deceleration. So that's what the uncertainty kind of feels like, and I'll trace the arc. So starting with California's 2030 climate targets. So on the books from AB 32, going back to Joe's presentation, we had this goal to return to 1990 emissions levels by 2020. When SB 32 and AB 398 came about, the statutory goal switched to reducing to at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And then following the scoping plan, the 2022 scoping plan, CARB put forth a 48% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030, that Governor Newsom then endorsed. Now, this 48% reduction is not statutorily required. This is kind of an ambitious goal from the administration and the Air Resources Board. And that press release is on the right-hand side of this slide. So next slide. So basically, these targets are ambitious. And so the orange line here is emissions, and the maroon and kind of light blue line that are well below the orange line are the 40% and 48% reduction lines for 2030. So we have a good amount of work to do in order to drive emissions down to our 40% or 48% by 2030 targets. Next slide. Given that work, CARB very reasonably started an informal rulemaking on the cap and trade program with potential changes to the 2021 to 2030 allowance budgets. And what you see here is just a visualization from one of CARB's first informal workshops, which I think is about a year ago, a little over a year ago, showing what allowance budgets would look like under a cap that CARB believed would hit a 40% by 2030 target in red, 48% by 2030 target in yellow, and a 55% by 2030 target in green. And sorry, I think this is actually from about 2 years ago. Yeah, that makes more sense. So these are quite sizable allowance reductions. And in this chart, you see the market reaction to CARB contemplating supply cuts. And so the blue line is secondary market prices for California carbon allowances, basically over the last 2 years. And starting on the left-hand side of the graph, you see a real price appreciation consistent with CARB holding workshops from 2 to 1 years ago. And this drove kind of a maximum price of around $43, which was a historic high for the California cap and trade program. As these workshops kind of went along, the optimism in the market grew, but then CARB kind of started going silent on the rulemaking. There was a JLCCP hearing where Dr. Bertrar from Resources for the Future proposed a devaluation of the allowance bank. And that was the first time the market significantly dipped, which is about halfway on this chart. And then kind of starting from that point, it was clear that CARB was delaying their regulation. So when CARB finally revised their rulemaking timeline, there was a significant dip in prices. There was a brief appreciation where CARB said that a rulemaking might drop in the coming weeks. But when that didn't materialize, there was yet another subsequent drop in allowance prices, getting us very close to the price floor. And when it became clear that the rulemaking was kind of delayed and that legislative extension would go before rulemaking, then Governor Newsom started speaking about timing issues. And one thing he said that drove the market nearly all the way to the floor is, quote, the getting legislative extension done this year is not absolutely necessary. So that is not what the market wanted to hear after a bunch of rulemaking delays. And this, by the way, kind of persists. Prices are at the floor right now. And I think the market is waiting for legislative certainty and regulatory certainty. Going back to Emily's discussion of the prolonged legislative discussion for AB 398, a long legislative process can certainly delay allowance prices. But my big takeaway from this chart is that the market primarily cares about allowance supply. And they got excited when CARB was seeming to follow through with its plans to significantly cut allowance supply. And then prices kind of fell back down to the floor, primarily because it's unclear when CARB will begin allowance supply cuts again. So that's a visualization of the uncertainty in this period. I think we have some positive news on the legislative side. In reaction to Trump's executive order explicitly attacking California's cap and trade program, Governor Newsom, the Senate pro tem, and the Speaker of the Assembly, kind of in a rare show of unity, committed to doubling down on the state's cap and trade program. We wrote a fact sheet that I will walk through very briefly on our website that essentially looks at the recent economics literature over the last 2 years and concludes that based on kind of the economic evidence that we see, doubling down on the cap and trade program would be a fantastic idea. So I'll briefly hit on those points and then pass over to Alicia. So why do we think doubling down on cap and trade would be a good idea? Well, first, it's clear that the program has significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. That's obvious because there's a price on emissions. It's especially obvious when the price is well off the floor. But most importantly, there are really good studies that very carefully identify control and treatment groups, one in Nature Climate Change that you see here, and one in the Journal of Public Economics that is not visualized here. This study in particular is a meta-analysis that shows the California Cap and Trade Program reduced emissions about 15% in the first 5 years of the program, below business as usual. That little figure on the right-hand side just asserts that 15% reduction in the early years is larger than all other cap and trade and carbon tax programs studied in this Nature Climate Change article. So we'll link to this. I'll send the link to this worksheet, but that's number one. Cap and trade has significantly reduced emissions. Number two, why we think doubling down on cap and trade is a good idea. It's affordable in absolute and relative terms. So in absolute terms, cap and trade is a good idea compared to doing nothing because we know the social cost of carbon is $190. The allowance price is $26 now. That makes it a good idea in absolute terms. It's also affordable in relative terms. And this kind of complements Emily's analysis and review of the scoping plan from 2017. This chart just shows a series of cost estimates for individual policies from standardized regulatory impact assessments, from the LAO, from CARB estimates. And my summary here is, subsidies are usually about an order of magnitude more expensive than the cap and trade program, and command and control can be another order of magnitude even more expensive than subsidies. Now, that's a vast generalization, but that's kind of the takeaway at a high level. Cap and trade is affordable. And then finally, the third point is that cap and trade reduces local air emissions and certainly has not increased local air emissions. So the two studies that articulate this very carefully and are very recent studies are the Hernandez, Cortez, and Kyle Meng paper and the Glenn Sheriff paper. Again, I'll share the worksheet here so that you can read further into this. So to summarize, we're in a real period of uncertainty. Regulatory delays have primarily dropped allowance prices, but we have hope in the form of legislative extension. We think extension is a good idea because of the reasons I just mentioned. But let's pass it over to Alicia to just give a summary of the really recent history. Like, what have legislative discussions around extension, what do they sound like just over the last 6 weeks? Then we can go to Q&A.
Thank you. I will just spend a few minutes discussing where we are right now on legislative extension, and then as Clayton said, it will go to Q&A. So now is the time to think about your questions and drop them into the Q&A box. All right, so last summer, and around, I believe, maybe July or August 2024, Senate President Pro Tem Mike McGuire announced that the Senate would be pursuing legislative extension of the cap and trade program this year in 2025, seemingly in response to signs of market uncertainty, which, as Clayton recently mentioned, were driven by regulatory delays to allowance supply cuts. Since then, each house has formed cap and trade working groups and introduced in February placeholder bills SB 840 and AB 1207, which have since been progressing steadily through the legislative process, though substantive language has yet to be proposed for each of these bills. I think the default bookends that stakeholders in the market seem to be expecting are either kind of a straight or a simple reauthorization of the program, which essentially would entail changing the expiration or the sunset date of the program, or on the other hand, a reauthorization that involves more substantive reforms is the word that has been used, which I read to connote a more significant redesign of the program. And there have been a few proposals around what that could look like. Earlier this month, the administration proposed a trailer bill in conjunction with the release of the May revise, which in essence reflects a simple or straight extension. It essentially changes the program sunset date and proposes to rebrand the program to Cap and Invest, which is also the name of the programs the program in Washington State and the program being contemplated in New York. So we're currently waiting to see what the legislature wants to do, whether to, on the one hand, align with Governor Newsom's proposed trailer bill or to propose an alternative direction via one of these placeholder bills. And so with that, I'll turn to discussing some of the key themes we've heard from the legislature in recent hearings, I think which will provide some, though not full, insight into how they might decide to approach the extension conversation. So to date, most of the substantive discussions on cap and trade in the legislature have been held through the budget committee hearings rather than policy committee hearings, with one exception, which was a joint Senate Budget Sub 2 and Environmental Quality Committee hearing. And I was asked to cover this portion of the presentation because as part of my day job, I follow all of these hearings very closely and enjoy doing so very much. I think there's a lot of really helpful context, and so I'll go through that right now. The first key theme, I think to no surprise to anyone who may be following this year's legislative cycle, is affordability. And affordability has really emerged as, I would say, the defining policy issue of 2025, dominating discussions across the legislative session and in relation to many policies. And so with cost of living top of mind for Californians, I think policymakers are approaching nearly every issue through this lens of its impact on the everyday consumer. Among the various facets of the crisis, energy affordability has become a central focus. Apparently, it's not the first time, as Joe described in this first section of the presentation. And rising utility costs are putting increasing pressure on household budgets. In recent legislative hearings, I've heard a recognition from legislators that cap and trade is not only, quote unquote, one of the most effective climate programs out there, to quote Assemblymember Bauer-Kane, but also, quote, the most cost-effective way for us to lower emissions, to quote Assemblymember Cotty Petrie-Norris. So in this context, there seems to be growing interest in the California Climate Credit, which is an important tool for softening the price impacts for utility ratepayers and is funded by the California Cap and Trade Program. There's also been discussion of further leveraging Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund revenue or auction revenue to address affordability, which I'll get into in a moment. Advancing climate efforts while protecting or even expanding jobs has also been a central theme that we've heard. Moving on to federal uncertainty, almost every hearing has raised concerns about the enormous gaps that federal funding freezes and or clawbacks could have on California's funding priorities, including ZEV credits and green tax credits. And that has been a central focus of the news over the past 2 weeks. CARB has explained that its 2022 scoping plan does account for uncertainty. And I will also add that these types of policy changes emphasize the cap and trade program's role in picking up some of the reductions that were supposed to but did not occur elsewhere. And of course, as Clayton mentioned, we also saw the president directly attack the cap and trade program through the April 8th executive order on protecting American energy from state overreach, which, as Clayton also mentioned, prompted this joint statement to double down on cap and trade this year. The third theme is climate leadership. Despite affordability concerns and federal threats, polling still confirms that Californians do care about climate change and fighting climate change, which is the driver of the LA wildfires, and supporting cap and trade. So consistent with that sentiment, both the administration and the legislative leaders continue to emphasize the need for California to continue leading and exhibiting climate leadership. Governor Newsom, as you may know, is now co-chairing America is All In, Their goal is to cut emissions by half by 2030. And most recently is also co-chairing the US Climate Alliance, consisting of 24 bipartisan governors and representing about 60% of the US economy. And similarly, legislators have emphasized the need to lead by example and secure the well-being of future generations. I think Assemblymember Bennett, who chairs the Assembly Budget Subcommittee, said, quote unquote, if California doesn't do its share, we can't ask and expect others to do the same. I think there's a recognition that California is uniquely situated to drive technological innovation. And finally, this new, I would say, relatively new concept of this nexus of value. And Assemblymember Jackie Irwin, the chair of the Assembly Cap and Trade Working Group, has made references to this term. It's a nod to Washington, where the concept originated. And Assemblymember Irwin and others in both houses have repeatedly expressed a desire to focus on aligning climate investments from auction revenue with visible, tangible public and legislative priorities. I liked Assemblymember Cotty Petrie Norris's description of this being a moment to get the biggest bang for a climate buck for the people of California. And a recurring theme is, what activities should auction revenue support? Those that mitigate climate change, or those that address legislative and constituent priorities? So that's a big question, I think, still to be determined. And there has been, I think, mounting skepticism towards continuous appropriations, and especially for projects like high-speed rail, which I think reflects this desire to be more involved, or the legislators' desire to be more involved in how and to whom funds are being dispersed. So I'll pause there. I see we have a number of questions. I guess I'll mention one final thing, which is there is an interest in ensuring the availability of funds goes back to this interest of ensuring the availability of funds goes back to good program design, and also addressing sources of uncertainty. That has been a question and a theme of discussion as well in these hearings. So with that, I think we can now go to our Q&A portion of the webinar. And I see a few questions coming in. Clayton, you may have been monitoring this while I was speaking, so maybe I'll turn it over to you to kick us off for that portion of the presentation.
Yeah, I've kind of tried to organize batches of questions. So I think the highest level one really speaks to like the interaction between federal inaction and subnational action. And that question is, does Trump's executive order and then in general attitude towards California and energy transition hurt or help Newsom support cap and trade? So yeah, I think I'll just leave the question as written. I think it's a well-written question. So anyone want to take that? Emily, if you don't, I'll have a go.
I think it's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball and, sort of understanding sort of where this will be taken. But I think it did seem like the executive order really did bring together, members of the legislature and the administration in sort of a pushback against, California is going to do this. We are ambitious, and really sort of exerting California's ability to continue with the cap and trade program. So I do think that if anything, it may be catalyzed, when you have a shared enemy, it's, easy to, join forces. But I'm not entirely sure. I think, there's been lots of discussion about, is there some federal action that could potentially undermine the existence of a cap and trade program? And that has been routinely sort of shot down. So I do think there is sort of this emphasis, especially given what's happening at the federal level, to think about sort of where states can take action on climate, especially given California's, very ambitious legislatively mandated targets. So it's a non-answer, sorry.
I was going to jump there quickly and just say that, I'm not a lawyer, so you shouldn't take take this too seriously. But I do think that I'll quote Mary Nichols to start, former chair of the board, and she said, quote, "Trump is doing the work for us." So it did catalyze things. And in terms of the federal legal challenges, lawyers that I've spoken with have said that they believe that California is fairly well insulated and protected, and they're not terribly concerned about what's coming out of Washington. That's what I'm hearing, at least.
I think that's largely consistent with what we're hearing and other work we've done. So that makes sense, Joe. Yeah, thank you, Emily and Joe. Um, yeah, I'll also mention, just because I'm on this trip with Washington, I do think uh, Trump has galvanized action in Washington, and there are even whispers that Oregon will come out with a cap and invest program in their short legislative session this year. So I do think for West Coast states broadly that being under attack from the federal administration is a potential motivator. And so you can make lemonade out of those lemons. Um, the next set of questions are kind of uh, quite a few questions around timing of legislation. So I'll try to batch these together. So maybe we can just ask, when will the legislator extend the program? That is not an answerable question, but maybe we can outline the scenarios. And do we expect changes to 1207 or 840 to address extension? And if so, when would those need to be amended? There's also a question on who may sponsor Governor Newsom's trailer bill. Alicia, do you want to start with
Happy
the
to speak to that
Yeah.
because that was the part of my presentation that we covered. So, as Clayton mentioned, that is an unknowable, or there's an unknowable answer as to when we will see legislative extension. I'll just refer back to the joint statement by Governor Newsom, the Senate Pro Tem Mike McGuire, and Speaker Rivas after Trump's executive order. So that joint statement came out about a month and a half ago, I believe. And that joint statement expressed an intent to pursue, in other words, finalize, is how I read it, legislative extension this legislative year, which concludes in mid-September. And so that is sort of the, I think, reasonable timeframe to expect. But we'll see. So that's the answer to when might we see legislative extension, essentially this legislative year, based on these prior statements. With respect to all the other questions, we're sort of currently all looking out for answers to those questions around if and when AB 1207 and SB 840 will be amended, if the legislature will sort of consider and or pursue Governor Newsom's trailer bill. So I would say to all of you who ask those questions, we share them, and it's important to closely follow developments over the next few weeks.
Yeah, and maybe we
Catch
should
all of
just
those.
well, I think we will with one additional statement, which is if extension is not quote unquote done through the trailer bill, that doesn't mean extension in June by June 15th. The next most likely route is just a policy bill, and the deadline for that is the end of the legislative session, so late August, early September, unless I'm misquoting. So I think that ropes into the co-sponsor question. It's like the legislative rank and file and legislative leadership is going to need to decide whether they want to play ball with Governor Newsom's proposed trailer bill, or if they want to go slower and do this through the typical policy bill process. So I think with that addition, we covered all three of the questions related to timing. So we have one question on revenues. So we have seen how prices can come off to roughly the minimum price when there's an exogenous threat, like COVID or Trump. This leads to lower revenues. Is there anything in the rulemaking that might be done to dynamically address this tendency to trade down to the floor? Thinking an emissions containment reserve, increase the auction reserve price, etc. I think I have some thoughts there, but does anyone want to take an initial bite at that apple? Yeah, okay. Okay, so the long-term thing I think that would be helpful here is if economists could do a better job explaining that high allowance prices means a low cost overall. And in other words, there are all these other policies we have in our portfolio that reduce emissions at much greater cost than cap and trade. The effect those have is that they lower the allowance price, even though total cost is higher because all these other policies are higher cost per ton. So we're in an affordability crisis right now with electricity and gas prices. And because the carbon price works through those price channels, the carbon price is kind of partially getting wrapped up in that affordability crisis. So there's this kind of very salient concern over cost, yet the policies that are not visible in our portfolio are much more costly in reality. So the long-term solution is just, I think, better education on how carbon pricing works. In the short term, I do think it'd be hard to, without that level of education, to increase auction reserve prices. That's just my personal opinion. And while I love the idea of an emissions containment reserve, it has received very little traction to date. It's complex and it looks very much like a price floor to an untrained eye. So I think the thing that we can do to stabilize GGRF revenues as a state is get through legislative extension as quickly as possible with a program that we can accept over the next 20 years, and then immediately move to a rulemaking that lowers allowance supply. I think just getting through the process that's ahead of us as orderly and efficiently as possible is the most realistic approach to shoring up GGRF revenues. Any edits or adds? I'm seeing head nods. That's great. Okay, thanks. We have a couple questions on linkage and then a couple questions on rulemaking timeline. So maybe we can go with, there's two questions on the rulemaking. Can you share your views on the rulemaking timeline, particularly in context of extension possibly not being wrapped up until late in the legislative year? And then what is kind of the most important changes related to the rulemaking? I also have opinions there, but I'll defer to my board members first. Yeah.
I can chime in here just again referencing what has most recently been said. I believe CARB's website was updated in March to provide an updated sense of the rulemaking timeline. I believe the language went something along the lines of, CARB intends to move forward with the rulemaking this year, so in 2025. So that's the latest from CARB. I don't know if Emily or Clayton want to add anything there. Okay.
No, I think that makes sense. Okay, and then finally, questions around linkage. So what is the prospect of further linkages with other carbon pricing programs like Washington's Cap and Invest? And is linkage with Quebec at risk? I think I can take these. I'll start with, is linkage with Quebec at risk? As most of you know, I think the linkage with Quebec and California was attacked under the Trump 1 presidency. At the time, I was at the International Emissions Trading Association, and we were a co-defendant for CARB in defending that case against the Trump DOJ. We won that battle pretty handily, I would say. My understanding of the legality here is that court case could potentially be brought back. I don't think we've heard that there's a possibility or desire to do that, but it could be brought back. My personal view is if that court case were to repeat, we would win pretty handily again. So I do not think the linkage with Quebec is at significant risk. And then in terms of further linkages with other carbon pricing programs, so Washington's program is the one that gets discussed most frequently. I'll remind everyone, Washington has caps hard-coded into their legislation through 2050, I think, and there is no sunset clause in the Washington Cap and Invest program. So just from a very pragmatic perspective, the California program beyond 2030 is somewhat unknown, and the Washington program is pretty well described through 2050. I think from a purely pragmatic perspective, California needs to get extension done and likely get a rulemaking done so that it knows the shape of its program through 2045 before they decide whether to link with Washington. So that's just a very pragmatic perspective. Whenever the two entities link, the next biggest issue is the allowance price. And although the efficiency gains from linking are larger, if the allowance prices are more disparate, politically in practice, jurisdictions like when allowance prices are pretty close before they link. So if linking were to happen today, the discussion I think would look like, well, the Washington price is quite high, the California price is significantly lower. How do we make the prices more similar before linking? And in what direction? Should Washington make its price lower? Should California make its price higher? Those are very important political discussions that are above my pay grade. But in practice, as I've studied linkage, prices need to be somewhat similar before jurisdictions say yes to linking. I don't know how it will play out in this context, but that's how it plays out in other parts of the world. I think that answers that question.
Can I jump in and add a little bit too, just in terms of timing and context. So there is legislation, SB 1018, that requires before any linkage takes place for there to be certain findings, and sort of Clayton sort of alluded to that. But you have to ensure that your jurisdiction, there's like enforceability that you can enforce across a different jurisdiction. That there won't be adverse impacts to California. So in order for there to be discussion of linkage, there would need to be sort of these findings made by the governor that would really point out that the linkage is beneficial. And again, because California is currently linked with Quebec, that would need to be a discussion that also happens with Quebec. Any sort of full bilateral linkage would need to be discussed by both jurisdictions, and maintaining and ensuring that there are sort of, yes, some fundamental program design elements that are consistent across the programs. They don't need to be identical, but that there needs to be sort of fundamental program designs to allow for a fully linked program.
That reminds me that Washington has a similar procedure with different requirements. So this will have to happen back and forth. And that also gave me time to be reminded of Washington had an update bill to its Cap and Invest program that I think all else equal, HB 1975, that I think all else equal makes linkage easier. So we'll discuss this in 2 weeks when we have Clean and Prosperous Washington on. But I think Washington is making smart moves to prep the ground for linkage. But given what I've said, given what Emily has outlined, I think linkage is certainly not imminent. Yeah. Okay, last question, or perhaps the last question. The political discussion seems focused on the use of revenues and to some extent skepticism of offsets. Do you see interest or pressure from the legislator to revise other program design issues? Great question.
Nancy, Nadine, do you want to take this?
I can add a little bit. I think as Joe mentioned in his discussion on, AB 32 and the brief 10 pages that it was, but really there was deference to the Air Resources Board in implementing programs. So I think we sort of saw something similar in discussions around AB 398. There were certain pieces in regards to, cost containment, the price ceiling, that the legislature did put into statute. But there also was a lot of deference to the administrative capabilities of the Air Resources Board, given their expertise in the area. So it's not sure. I think there's been some discussion about program modifications, but I think it's unclear whether that would be hard coded in legislation as Washington's caps till 2050, or if there would be sort of recommendations that would then be translated by the Air Resources Board through a regulatory process to implement. So I think there's been discussion on offsets. There's been discussions on price ceilings and all of the issues that sort of the Air Resources Board is considering or has discussed in their informal process, the rulemaking process, and the SRIA that was released. So I think there are some nuggets there that we can look to see sort of where the Air Resources Board was thinking about program modifications that would be required, and that can give an idea. But I think, yeah, whether those will be hard-coded in legislation or not, I think remains to be seen.
Yeah,
I
nothing
would
to add.
Oh,
Joe?
I very briefly that I hear of, occasionally, I actually hear a lot about affordability. I hear a little bit about environmental justice. I hear a little bit about program design and so forth. What I hear the most is a broad consensus to reauthorize. What that will look like, we don't know. But I'm confident that's the most central point of agreement that I've heard and seen in the legislature.
I think those are two great points to end on, and I'll just elaborate slightly on each one. So on affordability, I think this is where you see the legislature really retracing the conversations of AB 398, looking at the cost containment provisions, and going back to kind of Joe's initial point on AB 32, how prescriptive should we be, which is another discussion Emily highlighted. So to give an example on cost containment, and especially discussions around affordabilities and refineries, you have kind of Enviro and EJ wanting to take free allowances away from refineries. You have refineries wanting more allowances. And then you have some staff, some offices thinking about or discussing border carbon adjustments as a solution to kind of move beyond the free allocation or over allocation paradigm. So it's interesting to watch those discussions play out. And I think some legislators have an intuition to be more prescriptive, perhaps informed by the Washington experience. But then when they get into the details of how would you pick how many free allowances an industry gets, or how would you design a border carbon adjustment, there is a compulsion to then defer to the experts like the Air Resources Board. So I think that discussion around affordability is going to be very rich, and I think it will be the focus, as Joe highlighted. And I think, how prescriptive to be from the legislative perspective versus how to defer to CARB will be a key theme in that issue. And I will just reiterate, because it's also the last question we received. I don't see a world in which the legislator doesn't extend the cap and trade program. I think the question is just, what cap and trade program are we talking about? Is it the simple straight version, or is it a more reformed version? And I think that's really the discussion we'll be having over the summer. All right, we're a minute over. Thank you everyone for the excellent questions. Thank you to the Clean and Prosperous board members for joining and sharing your time. If you want to come to our next webinar, it's in 2 weeks, and visit our website to sign up for a newsletter. Thanks for attending.